My mom, and I was at Briggs before.
You are live.
Okay, this is the Senate Education Committee on February 4th. After a break, it's about 4 o'clock. We're doing some additional work on the governor's proposal. We have Secretary Saunders here and Jill Riggs Campbell, the Deputy Secretary or Acting General Deputy Secretary, to just continue the discussion with the committee. And so we're ready to go. So do we need to introduce, do you know everybody at the table? Should we introduce ourselves or?
I think we know. We
Okay,
spent a lot of quality. I feel like we're all close at this point.
So for the record, introduce yourselves and off we go.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Zoe Saunders, Secretary of Education.
Jill Briggs Campbell, Interim Deputy Secretary of Education.
We're also joined by our consultants at APA Consulting. I'll allow Amanda to introduce herself first.
Yep, Amanda Brown from APA.
And is Justin joining you as well?
Yeah, Justin Silverstein with APA.
Okay, great. Thank you. We appreciate the opportunity to join you this afternoon. This is intended to be a follow-up from last week's conversation. Last week, we shared the details around the foundation formula and went into specifics around the calculations and also the categorical aid. We did identify several questions that came up through our conversations and through other committees. So we've put together a brief presentation to really address some of the big picture questions and be able to expand upon those areas of inquiry to provide a little bit more insight into what went into the calculations. We also know that you probably have a lot of more focused questions as well. So this presentation is pretty brief, and so it's intended to allow for more robust conversation and dialogue around your areas of questions. I'll also note that this week we will be submitting a report on recommendations for governance. So as we know within the funding model, implicit in that are assumptions around scale and how we deliver education along with education quality. So just want to always reinforce that those pieces are really interconnected. And you'll hear that as we go through their presentation around sort of different policy choices that are part of the funding approach. So I'll hand it over to Amanda and Justin to walk through what some of the high level questions are. But I think a lot of what we heard was, specific to how the funding formula is applied to the CTE funding model. And we heard a lot of questions around how we make adjustments to the size of schools within the Vermont portfolio. And overall general questions as we think about comparing the overall spending with this proposal to our current education spending. So I will now allow Amanda and Justin to walk through those details.
Great, thanks. So we're going to start the first block. We're just going to walk back through the different adjustments that we've talked about, get into some more detail, especially around the school size and the CTE, and then take a look at how that kind of how everything comes together at some per pupil levels, and then I'll kick it over to Amanda after that to really look at the comparison. So this slide really kind of just reminds everybody about the different components that we talked about last week. A base funding amount going to every student of $13,200. Additional funding for economically disadvantaged students at 0.75. EL students at a 1.5 weight. CTE funding both in the base and then also through the CTE center weight of 1.3. Triple E funding remaining where it is today. The district sparsity weight similar to what is today, and the same as what is today, and then the size adjustment similar to what's going on in the tax capacity weights, but really resource based, and then we'll talk about how it's applied very differently. All of that comes together for the total funding through the base and weights, and that's everything in the green. But then, of course, additional funding that still needs to be in place for categoricals. And a couple of key things here: special education, the current level of categorical plus about 70 million, which is the estimate of the additional funding that has been that is being raised currently by districts as they put together budgets. So if you take current census block funding and federal funding for special ed, and you subtract that from the total spend for special education in the state, it's about that $70 million. Additional transportation funding, currently transportation is funded at 50% of, it's a 50% reimbursement, and so we basically doubled that. You'll see some per pupil amounts here. That is per every kind of student in the state. Those are the additional amounts of funding. And then we'll have the other categoricals still in place in a number of categories, including state place students and some other areas. So go to the next slide.
And Justin, before we move forward, can you expand on how to understand this within a multi-year rollout? So there are certain costs that are assumed within the first year of implementation, and there may be some additional evaluation around like special ed and so forth as we move forward. Can you kind of expand on that?
So, and yeah, help me out here if I'm not hitting quite what you're looking for here. With the special ed piece, we're looking at what's currently there and ensuring that as we get started that districts kind of aren't on their back foot and don't have the dollars available to fund the special ed services that are needed. We know for special education, one of the goals of the census block funding and going forward is really trying to understand costs and get to the efficiency and serving students appropriately, but also reducing the cost of special ed. And so over time, we could see that going down. Transportation, similarly, with 52 districts now, as you go down to the proposed 5 districts, we would assume there'd be some efficiencies, less contracts, likely, hopefully less spent kind of per kid on transportation. So this is just ensuring day one that, again, districts aren't in a place where they don't have the dollars to do what they're doing today, knowing there's going to be efficiencies and scale built as we put in the new system. Okay, so the size adjustment. Currently, when we think about the tax capacity adjustment for school size, really there are 2 ranges in which schools would be funded. So one is any school between 250 students and 100 students, and the other is any school below 100. And every student in schools of that size get the same adjustment. And so effectively what that creates is a couple one piece that we really don't want to have in a formula, which is a cliff, right? So a school that is going from 99 students to 101 students actually loses quite a bit of funding in the current formula. So we're trying to address a couple things as we look at this smoother size adjustment that we've created. And so one is to make sure that we're adjusting for the cost differences based on different sizes, knowing that the evidence-based model is utilizing a 450 student model school or prototype school in order to set that evidence base amount. And so we want to ensure, and since we know that many schools in Vermont are below that 450, that any school below that is getting the adjustment it needs to provide the similar educational opportunity for their students. And so what we looked at is school enrollments of 50 through 450. We did, and it's laid out in the report, really adjusted for very specific resource differences that would be needed as schools get smaller, both in instructional personnel, but also in the cost they might face for things like maintenance and operations. And then we created this smooth curve here, which is similar at some of the data points to work that was done by AIR back in 2019, but has the key difference of funding any school in the state that is below 450 with some level of adjustment for their size and having it be very smooth. So the addition or subtraction of one student has a very minimal impact on the funding that would be received by that school or would be generated by that school. And so what you see...
Before you go on, question?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. Just a question on this size adjustment formula. Is this part of the proposal or is it, okay, so it seems a little bit counterintuitive, being that we're maybe trying to incentivize schools to actually grow, not stay the same size. So, and maybe it's in a next slide, whatever, but can you at least explain how this size adjustment affects the efficiency approach that's been discussed?
Yeah, and so...
Find it, and I'll let you, Justin, expand on the detail of it, but we recognize that this is a multi-year approach, right? And so we're building in assumptions that it will take longer to achieve optimum scale for our entire state system. So within our initial modeling for fiscal year 28, we're assuming that we're carrying some of the cost for our smaller schools. However, while there's still the same number of schools, there would be adjustments in terms of staffing and programming. And there are options for schools to make more accelerated planning decisions around consolidation to achieve the array of programming. But we recognize that is a longer term process that also would need to involve the leadership of the new districts to supporting in a way that's going to be optimal. But yes, as we identify this work and we're clear around how we're defining education quality and financial solvency, there are specific guardrails that we put into place that allows for the work to kind of move ahead of the schedule. And we've heard that really clearly from the field. We know a lot of superintendents and principals are having conversations around consolidating and sharing resources. And I think as we get concrete, right, and as a state around what these policy decisions are, that work would continue to accelerate. But we, for the modeling, felt like it was important to carry some of the cost, understanding that there will take more time to get to the optimum scale.
Yeah, and just to build on that, so the way the formula is designed is to be responsive to the portfolio of schools you have. And so it's really a two-part system. One, you have the adjustment that you need that recognizes the difference in cost of different size settings in your formula. And then the second piece of that is setting criteria around who's eligible to receive that funding. This is where we get into the idea of you start off by applying it to all schools, and then over time, to Zoe's point, move to schools that are small by necessity versus small by choice. So the adjustment itself stays the same because you are still going to have some schools that likely will be smaller than those larger sizes in the base due to practical limitations like geography or sparsity, and also considerations around your facilities. You may have, our example we keep using, you may have two schools of 100 students right next to each other that seem primed to be one school, but neither facility could support 200 students. So they are still necessarily small given their facilities restrictions. So it's both the size adjustment being in the formula is one piece of the puzzle, and then the policy decisions around who's eligible to receive that size adjustment can change over time.
And is that ultimately built into the proposal? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So
it is both the formulas in there, and then the funding right now that's being generated of about 60 million is applying it to all schools. So to Secretary Saunders' point, over time you would expect that amount of funding to be generated to decrease as you consolidate schools where possible.
Does the ultimate proposal build in the notion of small by choice and small by, and so there's a path laid out for what that means?
Yes,
and how,
yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So
because as Senator Weeks said, looking at this in isolation,
yeah,
it is counterintuitive because it's almost like
correct.
It's almost like saying keep your
right.
I think, and the sooner we can identify what those criteria are, the sooner our partners in the field will start to move. And when we give them the guardrails, they're really good at solving the problems,
when
right?
you say the sooner we kind of just said the sooner we develop them, so they're not developed yet.
We put on page 7.
Yeah.
So again, those are policy considerations that we would like to bring forward to you.
Okay.
And those would help to provide really clear guidance. The other piece of this is, while we're building a funding formula that's based on research, right? And we can ensure that with this amount of funding, the state can guarantee that you can provide a robust education. There's still flexibility with how districts will choose to use those funds. So as you think about planning within these larger districts, there is a cost to holding on to the smaller schools, right? And so those are broader conversations that the district will need to have as they make decisions around what those impacts are. So is that limit opportunities to provide a broader range of middle school options or high school options that you would like? These are conversations that as a district, they would be intentional around planning to think about building really strong feeding patterns from your elementary, middle to high school. But there's flexibility within the district. And one of the things we'd love to bring forward next week is some scenario planning as we think about a district of around 12,000 with this type of needs and this school portfolio with this foundation funding formula. What would be some of those options that a district might pursue within that focus of local control? We are building in as this proposal some requirements around class size, right? So that is an input in the system that is important, but there is flexibility in other areas to make different decisions around how you would use the funding.
Okay.
And I just want to make sure I get my math right when I'm looking at this. So we got our base foundation, then we'll times it by whatever LTA DM that we need for the student, and that comes up to that price. And then we add in also any special education or anything in the blue.
Yes.
And then we drop down here, and if you're a school 50, we add another 40, just rounding down, $4,500 per student.
Would be in your waiting.
Yeah.
That's in here?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, great.
And I think,
Adjustments for school.
I think this, the
All
next two tables will help because we get specific around what this looks like. in
All right,
terms
so this
of
table's
funding.
just, all right.
Yeah, so that is kind of showing you the methodology and how we're trying to.
I'm a
smooth
little
out
slow
the-
at times, so
No,
you know.
no, this is all really good.
There is a
So
lot to take in here.
There's a lot to take in. And I think our talking point on that side is we're trying to smooth out that curve.
Yep.
So that you
No,
don't
that
have
does
as
make
big of a
sense. It's
swing
great.
if you have one or two students that, change with enrollment. And then this, the next two tables will get more specific in terms of what that means in terms of overall spending.
So this next slide starts to build, I think, Justin, what you're talking about is what are the different components and dollar amounts you would get kind of per student for each of these adjustments. And just to kind of put everybody in understanding here, when we look at the very top here in step one, we're going to be differentiating by these different school sizes. So across the top are the different school sizes. And then everything below that are either the district or student characteristic adjustments. And those you'll see are always the same amount per pupil. And what we're using is just basically the average amount that is generated per ADM in the state for that adjustment. And so clearly that would differ based on different districts, on if you have a different, if you have district sparsity or if you have more or less EL or at-risk kids, but this is just the average. And so up the top in this step one, what you see, and just what we were looking at in the last slide, is that, a school with 500 students, every student's going to get the base of 13,200. They will receive no school size funding. And so their size adjusted base funding is that 13,200. If you go all the way down to a school of 50 students, each of those students is going to receive an additional, as you mentioned, over $4,500. So their size adjusted base funding is 17,766. On average, that size adjustment produces about $760 per kind of each student in Vermont. And so the kind of average size adjusted base is a little under 14,000. District sparsity, again, is going to be very specific to the district, but overall in the state, it produces about an additional $700. The Triple E, as we know, very few students, and it has that kind of negative adjustment right now, takes off about $60. The economically disadvantaged, on average in the state, is about $4,300. English learners for almost $450. CTE we're putting in here, but we know that we'll talk a little bit more about it later. That would actually be going to the BOCES as about $600. And then we have some additional categorical we wanted to put together to, as best we can, kind of apples to apples funding today. That's about $765. And so what you'll see is, on average, a student in this smaller school is going to be generating a little under $25,000 per student. And in the kind of at the 500 student level, it's about $20,000 per student. On average in the state, we're looking at $20,726. So you're getting over about $7,500 more than the base on average once you put together all of those school size, district sparsity, and student adjustments that we are proposing into this foundation formula.
Is there other states using this type of formula?
Yes.
And which ones?
36.
33, 36, yeah. And some of them are way more detailed, and Justin and Matt can talk about it. They have multiple weights for every EL student. They have multiple layers for economically disadvantaged.
Right, I know that's been asked before, but
No,
we've seen
it's
so
good.
many numbers.
Of the 36 other states, or 33, how many are smaller rural states, or have any similarities to ours?
I know in the foundation funding formula report, or the funding formula report, we also talked about that comparison to neighboring states in New England that also offer that. So I think, Justin, if you could expand on that, and provide some comparison.
And that's in your appendix B of your funding formula, page 25.
You're right on with the numbers.
Justin, do you want to
You wanna-
speak to smaller, more rural states that use a similar kind of
Yeah.
approach?
And so again, I think Vermont, the state closest to Vermont is, as far as number of students, is Hawaii, probably. Hawaii, maybe Wyoming. Oh, Hawaii is considered to be using a foundation formula, but they are a single district. And so they've actually just taken the approach of just, they are a single district for the whole state. It's run that way.
All the islands?
Yep.
Wow, okay. That's-
Yep. And so what they have are, and I'm going to get the name wrong, but effectively
Complex areas.
Yes, thank you. So you might have a couple on Oahu and a couple on the Big Island, and then all of Maui is kind of its own smaller, being run together. But overall, the state is running the school system itself. I think what is really true about foundation formulas generally is that there are plenty of states who have a lot of variation in size and a lot of rural places. And so you can think of just, it's easy for us sitting in Colorado. Colorado, yes, has a couple of huge districts around 90,000, but we also have a number of districts who are at 50 students or below. And so, have a foundation formula that's trying to adjust for those differences, and a lot of work on kind of what's like a necessarily small district versus a not, more of a district of choice kind of feel. So I think there's components of a lot of states who have these rural settings that you can take a look at in foundation formulas generally that can map really well to Vermont.
Thank you.
I would think that economically disadvantaged is either like a very blunt instrument or it is broken out in a gradient in other states. I mean, it's like, what is the cutoff? It's right now just for your reduced lunch income levels, right? So what are those now? And are we going to keep those? And are they two different levels?
And so the question is, what is our poverty metric
Mm-hmm.
to understand need, and then how to differentiate support by need?
Right.
Question.
And I mean, my mind goes to like, that's a lot of money per student. Is that money better? Is it going to be dedicated to the kinds of community school oriented resources that make them better off?
Right. So I think as part of the evidence-based approach, there are assumptions around how those weights can be used to support, extended learning opportunities and high dosage tutoring and kind of the wraparound support, but I'll allow Justin and Amanda to expand on that. And then I think there's a policy component to this as well, and thinking about how do we budget in an equitable way. And
Right.
so there's a equity budgeting model that we would like to discuss, and it builds off of some practices I think that are really promising in Vermont to ensure, I think to your point, that those resources are really directed at the areas of highest need and have a really profound impact on student opportunity.
Go ahead.
Well, how much do you estimate, like, let's say we got out of the universal school meals model, some of this money still needs to be used to purchase food for kids, right? Like, I was a free lunch kid. I don't think I needed a lot of extra tutoring or support in that way. I just ate food, that was like farm fresh food. So I'm just unclear, like, what are all the things we're doing for an economically disadvantaged student, and how are you thinking about directing that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and I think I was just going to say there's a couple things to unpack there. The meals themselves tend to be funded through federal funds for free and reduced price lunch students. So just kind of naming that's outside of what we're thinking about as far as the funding for economically disadvantaged that the state's providing. But to Zoe's point, the resources we've identified for the evidence base include that additional social emotional support, interventionist support before and after school programming, and allows communities to make the choice in how they want to provide those services. To your point about it could be a community schools model. I will also say the metric, free and reduced price lunch, is the most common metric used across the country for identifying economically disadvantaged students, which tends to be used as a proxy for the number of students that you need to provide additional supports to be successful in school. It is not ever intended to be a one-to-one. To your point, a student on free lunch might not need the extra supports, while a student that doesn't receive free and reduced price lunch does. But there's such a correlation between income and outcomes for students that it's a pretty good proxy of the level of additional resource that you'll need in the building. So I think those were all the points I was going to make. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that was some information.
If I can build on just, I think early on you asked if there were, and maybe I heard this wrong, different levels of funding for different kind of maybe categories of free reduced price lunch. On average, that actually hasn't happened in most states. Because I think the things that are happening is with the community eligibility provision, states are looking at other ways of counting students, just because the community eligibility provision effectively allows districts to qualify all their students for free reduced price lunch, which means the actual collection of data is getting a little bit dirtier over time. And so I think that's one piece. And then instead of having different weights for different types of economically disadvantaged students, what is a little bit more common is for states to have a concentration factor at your highest percentages of free reduced price lunch. So that would really be kind of the only differentiating weight that might be in a formula that you'd find in other states. Whereas for special ed or EL, a lot of states use multiple weights for different categories.
And Justin, can you also expand on some of the decisions around when states approach how to establish the base versus the weight amount? So I think what we're putting forward is a more generous base to ensure that there's ample resources for all students to have this robust education, and then being able to add additional support for those students that need more targeted services. There are other models in other states, and you can see in the chart that have a very low base amount. So the challenge in that scenario is you have a low base amount and you may not have as many students that have needs. It's really hard to actually operate a school at that level of funding. But if you can expand upon that, because that was a really explicit choice in this model of really building a generous base to ensure a high quality and high resource education system for all students.
No, absolutely. You know, taking that evidence base, which is built on decades of research about what's being shown to be effective for students, and really ensuring a, really good educational opportunity for all students, and then adding on resources for social emotional health for students in Vermont above what the evidence base has identified, adding on additional career readiness opportunities at both the middle school and the high school level, which includes some kind of traditional school-based CTE programming, additional teachers at the high school so that you can have a more robust educational opportunity for the high schoolers. So adding in a lot of those pieces. But if you look, and I think this is to Secretary Saunders' point, what we are identifying here is a really robust base and relatively, and not even relatively, absolutely high weights, especially in a dollar amount compared to what's going on in the rest of the country. And so it's really trying to do both, right? Very robust for all kids, but then really ensuring you have the resources needed for those students who need the most. Because what we do see as we looked at data is, where you have your biggest gaps are for your EL and your at-risk and your special education students, right? So you need those additional resources to start to get those similar outcomes for kids.
So, and I do think there is this policy piece around having an equity-based budget model. We do have some good examples of this in Vermont, as Secretary Saunders was saying. And for example, in one of our districts, they allocate funding proportionally to schools by the student characteristics, right? Which is exactly what we do with federal title funding, right? It's proportionate to the students that are driving the dollars to ensure that they get those resources. And then in addition, what that district does is it has sort of an additional amount on top for its highest needs schools that they're sort of calling an innovation grant, right? And those schools are making those choices around, it gives them that ability to be creative and to be innovative, right? And we actually see that as a potentially really great role for the school advisory councils. And folks have really been asking, well, wait a minute, if we move to big districts, how do we engage? And one of the things that we need to articulate, and we plan to do so, is what does this look like, this new system for the parent, the community member? What does it look like for an educator or a building leader? What does it look like for a student? What does it look like, so really articulating at all levels of the system, what would this look like? That engagement around how you might spend those dollars to support students in your building, I would offer that in a lot of schools, there's a higher level of engagement than we probably have right now, right? And so we're really shifting, and so you can speak to this even more. We're shifting where it is that people engage. It's not the engagement at town meeting day on the budget after it's baked and you're saying, oh, it went up 2%, yes or no. It's you're engaging way at the front end in actually building the budgets and identifying the priorities for your school community and what is your school identity and what are the things that are most important. And I know it's an unusual construct in Vermont. It's a really common construct in other states. That's where the engagement happens on the building.
Can I ask one more question? Are you at some point, you don't have to answer this now, going to be prepared to quantify anything we would want to backfill that we don't get from the federal government? I mean, free lunch, as I've articulated to some in the past, is not just a commitment to feeding kids. It's free SATs, it's free college applications. If it's really a poverty reduction and pathway to poverty tool, there's a lot of other important supports that go with being a free lunch kid. And they're why I'm here right now. And I think we need to make sure we have a commitment to the full picture of what's at stake if the federal government pulls away from these commitments to low-income kids.
Yeah, this proposal is very much focused on a whole child approach, and I think what you're signaling is there may be changes in terms of federal funding, and it's important for us to really, as a state, really get future-proofed, right?
Mm-hmm.
We, within this proposal, will still be one of the top spenders in education in the country, but we'll be able to do that in a way that will be using those resources more efficiently and effectively, and in ways that are really going to drive student outcomes. So I think that's an important point overall, is that we still will be a top spender. It is important for us to structure this in a way that is sustainable so that we are kind of future-proofing our education system to federal changes or to, economic downturn. So it's an important point, and is actually, I think, given us even more sense of urgency to do this work and to accelerate this work, so that our communities are resourced to meet the needs. We've seen in our analysis that our higher needs communities do rely on the federal funding to be able to differentiate that support. We're not seeing that type of differentiation with the funding that's coming out of the state, right? And that's why we're really focusing on this equity approach in making sure that Vermont has a funding system that truly is equitable with all the dollars that we're spending on education, that they're going into places to support the highest need students.
So I just want to say, I like what I think I'm hearing you say about the levels of decision making, and where you're actually talking about some decisions actually being able to be made at the level of the school.
Yes.
So that principals actually have real authority to make some decisions and be entrepreneurial and
Yes.
creative, and with different, I think you're talking about different decisions being made at the appropriate level.
That's correct.
But actually moving a lot of it down, devolving authority in a way that it's not now.
That's correct.
I just will say, as we're proceeding here, I think that's headed in the right direction.
Great. Yeah, that's
So we
the
could,
intent.
yes, but we have to pay attention to time too. We've
Okay.
got some slides to get through. So yes.
Advisory council, at what level? AOE?
No, the school advisory councils will be for every single school. And that would have representation from students and parents, community members, staff, partners, to be engaged in those conversations that are really about strategic resource allocation for the school, that really students and parents would see playing out on a daily basis in their students' experience.
And things like the school improvement plan, which is a
Yes.
state and federal requirement. So it's not, like a booster or a PTA. It actually has specific responsibilities within the governance structure at a very local level.
Correct.
And we can go pretty quickly through this slide. It really is taking the information you saw on the table on the previous slide and just breaking it up into a pie chart, highlighting the fact that about 2/3 of all funding really is coming from the base. The next biggest pot of funding, almost 21% would be coming through that economically disadvantaged. And that's a mix of both a really strong weight and also, having close to 40% of the students in the state receiving that weight, right? So that's the mix there. 3 categories at about 3.5% or a little bit above, including some of the categorical funding, that district sparsity, and the school size, as long as it's applied to all schools under 450. That would change once that kind of necessarily small definition is set. English learners, very high weight of 1.5 weight, but it's with far fewer students. And then 2.8% going to CTE, just highlighting the fact that that would actually be going to the CTE BOCES. And then the last slide here is just trying to show kind of the total funding that would really happen per CTE FTE. And that includes base funding of $13,200. That is related to the individual student and going to their home district. And then the additional weight of 1.3, which generates about 17,000, that would be going to, that generated about 5,200 would remain with the district. And then 8,000 of that funding would go to, would be going directly to the CTE BOCES on a behalf payment along with the 17,000. So what you really see here is that each CTE center-based student is generating around $30,000, 25,000 for the CTE center and running those programs, and 5,000, which is really ensuring that the educational opportunity and the responsibilities of that home district are being met. So it's, the guidance counseling that's still happening, making sure the student has the diploma because they are actually rewarding the diploma, and ensuring that the educational opportunities for the students who remain in that high school are strong. Because as you lose students to the CTE centers, you can, sometimes what we've heard is that schools can struggle to have that robust high school programming. And this is really trying to create a balance there and really prioritizing CTE generally in the state, right? And so having the dollars available to have those robust programs at CTE and keeping strong programming for the students who remain at their high school.
Thanks, Sheriff. So I believe this is the first time that BOCES has popped up in your presentations. Can you provide a little bit of background on your thought and why introducing it here?
Yeah, so the overall kind of theory, we've been studying CTE and the CTE governance for almost 2 years. With the report that we at APA did for the legislature, we really did focus on funding going directly to CTE centers, where right now there's this kind of 3-pronged approach where some money is going on behalf, some money is going directly to CTE centers, and then there's quite a bit of funding coming from tuition. That creates, different kind of tensions within the system. As we kept studying the best way to implement, what we found is that the scale for CTE in the state, there's a lot of centers, there's 17 centers, but most of those centers are pretty small. And right now, a lot of them are replicating things that they have to do, right? So they're handling their own PD. They are, help doing Perkins grants. There's a lot of things that are being replicated. And so as we worked through the system, we really thought having a single governance entity was very important. And as we went through this larger kind of shift to the system and focused on the 5 districts, we thought a BOCES would be the kind of the way to go here. I think it's a BOCES that we still need to get kind of the specific language on exactly what this BOCES looks like, but it would be all CTE centers being served by this BOCES. They would be providing the professional development. They would be providing helping with curriculum, helping with program quality, and really helping with budgeting. So really taking the way we think of it, all the things off the plate of the CTE centers that they don't need to be doing to really make sure there's effective programming for students. And so kind of getting that out of the way of what's going on at the centers, but then also ensuring really quality programming and an equity of quality programming across the state. Because right now there's a lot of variation in what's going on.
We can signal,
What's that acronym
we will
for?
be
This is kind of,
BOCES,
yeah.
Board of Cooperative Education Services. And and we'll be discussing more about the CTE proposal so we don't get derailed, but I think you were gonna speak about BOCES and the larger governance.
Yeah,
concept,
overall,
right?
I think we're starting to get into some conversations around governance, which we hope to engage further on with you later this week. But part of this approach is really identifying what level of expertise needs to exist at what level of the system, all the way from the classroom to the school, to the region, to the agency of education. So last year, the legislature passed the BOCES bill with the intention of being able to provide shared services across districts. And so that design is kind of layered onto our current construct. And certainly we've seen some success with districts being able to organize these type of shared service agreements. But there's also a risk of creating more bureaucracy and more cost on top of an already overly kind of complex governance structure. So when you think about moving to a regional district, it's not just thinking about our current central office, it's actually expanding the capacity of a central office of a larger region to provide some of this additional services and support in terms of teacher preparation. We've also been thinking about to what degree that can happen within the district and what other specialized services would be needed within the BOCES. So part of what we're bringing forward is we still see a role for the BOCES, but that it would be organized in a different way to align with this different governance model, and would also be intentional around creating some kind of lines between what the Agency of Education is able to support and what other specialized services might be needed. As we walk through this, there are different conversations in scale for K-12 versus scale for CTE, and so we'll be able to expand on that. But I think overall, there's just a lot of, I want to signal that there's a lot of intentionality around building in the right expertise and the right support at each level of the system, and thinking about where the BOCES falls within that governance structure. We do still see a role for the BOCES, but it's organized differently within this new governance construct.
So if this BOCES is gonna work, I think the original intent was that districts could opt in. They didn't have to, are we gonna tell them that that's now a new layer and it's gonna be a part of the system for funding, right?
So part of the funding model is assuming that these services could be available through our current funding, so that they would opt in. But those are some specifics that we'll go through.
So we should keep moving here. Sorry, that's okay. We'll get to the comparison.
Yeah, so I want to walk through a couple slides trying to, as best we can, compare what are two very different systems from each other, your current system and what the recommended system is. So the first piece I want to think about is what we mean when we get to that base funding. So there's a couple columns that are our recommended policy proposal versus the current system. So you can see that top row is the statewide average. So I'm going to start there. That you have that base in the foundation formula of 3,200. But once you account for the differences in categorical adjustments, so increased categorical funding for special education and for transportation, and then some reduced funding for technical education, EL services, and small schools that we are kind of taking off the top because we're now calculating it through the foundation funding. So not removing the funding itself, but removing the categorical. That nets to a little closer to 14,000. If we then look at the two last columns, those are your current spending, and we're looking at that in a couple ways. The farthest right is probably what you're most familiar with, which is your per pupil spend, which is your the FY25 education spend per your Act 127 weight. So that's per your long-term weighted ADM is your per pupil spend. We then kind of took that in the column just to the left is taking that same FY25 ed spend, but dividing it by the number of weighted students we're recommending to, so again, try to make a little more apples to apples what we have in the two columns. So you'll see that when you looked at your per pupil spend right now, your per weighted student in the system, it's actually a pretty similar amount to what's recommended through our foundation formula. When you look at education spend per weight.
Oh no.
And that really represents that shift in scale that we're talking about. And sorry, I think my internet might have cut out just for a second there. But the other two pieces I wanted to highlight in this table, and again, try to move pretty quickly through it, is taking your existing districts and bucketing them into groups by their size and by their need. And what we can see is that by size, your spending at what we could think about as the base level is pretty similar really under any of the models. There's not much difference. But when we look at it by district need and grouping your districts equally into kind of 3 buckets based on who has the lowest need, the middle need, the high need, you can see in our recommended model that at a base level, so not the additional funding you would generate for the weights, but the funding you have for all students, it's pretty comparable. And that's what you would want to have in a system that's providing that equal opportunity across the state. What we see now when you look at your current system is there's quite a bit of variation. So right now, your low need districts per weighted student are spending about $2,000 more than your high need districts. So that's what we've been showing in some other reports, that while your system is designed to provide that extra tax capacity and possibility for additional funding in those communities, local decisions are making it so that high need communities are not generating those extra dollars at the scale you might expect. So we just wanted to highlight that variation. And if we had included on this slide kind of some minimum maximums in our recommended, there's about 13,000 would be the minimum base and 14,000, so not a very big difference. Your current system is 8,000 to like 30,000 at a per weighted student level. So you have a lot of variation in what each district is spending based on those local budget decisions after your system has accounted for what it thinks about are the differences because of need or size. So that's really something to think about as you're moving the system, that's one of the benefits of moving to a foundation formula. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to shift here. Oh, yeah.
Before we go, Ken.
Well,
There's a lot on this slide. So
well, the quickest question was on the weighting. Senator Hardy asked it, that you didn't, the weight systems are 2 totally different. And she was trying to drive at that at the time, but I just, when your weighting system and the traditional one right now are totally different, correct?
exactly. And that's why you'll see there's 2 columns under that current to recognize the fact that your per pupil spend, if you thought about per weighted pupil in your current system, is using very different weights than what we're recommending in our system.
Okay.
So
Just wanted to
the
clarify
column,
that.
Yep, exactly. So that's why you see that really
Question.
significant difference between the 2 columns.
I think that discussion was referencing the fact that APA has reviewed prior research that has gone into policy decisions within the state of Vermont and kind of looked at how this overall funding compares to some of those recommendations in terms of the overall funding that those would propose. So I think that's where the question came from. But this is a different methodology and would be a different way.
Yeah, she was using tax base compared to.
Yes.
Yeah, and so what we see, I think, that really jumps out in the bottom right corner of this table is in your higher needs communities, your students with higher needs, you would expect, if our funding system was operating as intended, that should be higher. In your lower needs communities, it should be lower, and we see the exact opposite. And what we see is where that's being made up, where we are supporting those high need students, is through federal dollars, which, to your point, Senator, is something we need to be considering right now. That is the place that we're actually supporting these students, as opposed to in our own current funding system.
So the next slide shifts gears a little bit to think about total funding. So not just funding that's driven at that base level for all students, but what's total funding once you factor in that additional funding for school size, district sparsity, and student need. So then you can see statewide, the column on the left, the total funding is our recommended total funding, to clarify, versus FY25 current spending. So you see statewide, it's a net difference of 8%. So we are saying that using that kind of evidence-based model, we would expect both a rich evidence-based base as well as weights and adjustments for different school and district characteristics, that you could be spending 8% less than currently is being spent. The difference between groups by size is very similar between your smallest districts, your larger districts, they're all around that 6 to 8% difference. But what we're seeing, back to our conversation about your current system, you have lower spending in your higher need communities. So what we are recommending is actually not a reduction or much of a change in your highest need communities. So on average, it's a 0% change between, and it's a little, $50 difference between the two. So there's a little difference, but they're largely the same. You see that difference is then offset by larger differences in spending in lower need communities. And so while overall a net reduction statewide, our recommended total funding is estimated to be higher than current spending in 36 districts. So 30% of your districts, this is actually more than they're generating on their own right now through local budget decisions. And then just a couple highlights. So the question, rightly so, has been, where do savings come from? And it's a bit tricky to calculate because we started from the foundation formula based on a desired future state. So moving to more efficient, larger districts, using an evidence-based model of what the research says is needed to support student success, adjusted for Vermont context and priorities such as additional CTE, mental health, teacher salaries. So our resource estimates are developed from scratch of what that system costs versus starting with the current and making reductions to get to cost savings. So it's a bit of a directionality challenge. It also, this funding represents the recommended amount of funding that the state and therefore Vermonters collectively should be responsible for providing. So again, right now we're seeing a large differences between communities of what they're receiving and what they're spending. So this is really what should the state be responsible for, and therefore all Vermonters are responsible for providing. It does not include any additional local funding. So that would be a separate policy conversation if you choose to allow additional local funding on top of what the state system covers. It also, as I highlighted, differences between recommended and current spending differ widely between communities based on their current variations in spending. And there's no change or increases in about a third of communities, which are often high need. And then back to what we talked about earlier, the goal would be the local communities, the local districts to decide how to use funding. So again, shifting where they plug into the budgeting conversation. And one more slide. So again, well, it's kind of, difficult to quantify cost savings, operating fewer districts and setting education quality standards like minimum class sizes. So the other two levers that we've been talking about as part of this total plan is expected to lower administrative overhead by reducing the number of central offices that you have and having districts operate at an efficient scale, improving staffing efficiencies. So by being in one district, you can now share staff across schools and achieve those evidence-based class sizes. I think, Jill or Zoe could speak to this a little bit more, but over time, really, Vermont is facing some staffing shortages across the state, and a large percentage of roles that are being filled by teachers with, say, provisional licenses. So some of the effort to right-size your current workforce will help address those ongoing staffing shortages and ensure qualified teachers in every classroom. It also has the potential to reduce costs in purchasing and centralized services and contracted fees. So reducing a lot of this duplication that we're seeing district to district, and overall increasing the equity between districts in terms of student need, community property wealth, and as we can see in earlier slides, the differences in spending. So really making that more equitable. And last point is that it will require a period of transition. So to be thoughtful that you couldn't do this tomorrow, that it'll take some time to get there. And how do you think about that transition plan? And that was it. So maybe we'll turn the slides off so we can see faces a little bigger.
So we have a question timer.
Any questions before we?
They can wait.
What's that?
They can wait.
No, it's okay to ask questions.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Ask questions, or if the questions aren't fully formulated and there's just particular areas that you would like us to dive deeper in, that would be helpful too. And then we can organize a subsequent testimony to zero in on those areas. Yeah.
I started to mention this as like, for me, I really zero in on the maintenance and operations piece of things, and that may seem strange, but in the big picture, I think there's a lot of agreement about a foundation formula. It truly comes across as more equitable and, you know, more transparent and fair, et cetera. The detail that I'm stuck on, and maybe you all explored this and abandoned it, is that the system is full of sticks, right? It's often, you know, this is not, but I'm just saying our system now, every time we've tried to do reform, it's full of sticks. It's like, you have to do this or else you're getting a penalty of some kind. I believe that there's enough savings in this proposal, and if you pulled out the additional maintenance and operation dollars from the foundation formula, to give each large district a pot of money to say, use this to take care of your deferred maintenance, build regionally excellent facilities and schools. Like, I can't get over that the best thing we could do in all of this to actually guarantee that the facilities get better and we have newer and fewer is to take those savings and plow them back into those large districts making smarter regional physical plant decisions. And that would be like the greatest carrot I think we've offered in 20 years.
So I just want to call out one thing there, like a technicality, but an important one. The M&O that's in the base is a 3% M&O, which is the national standard for maintenance and upkeep of your facilities. If we had fewer facilities, you're right, if the number would go down by definition. So I think what you're saying is the cost savings that we're modeling here, could they be reinvested to support capital
and I
construction?
imagine most
But I would
M&O.
caution against pulling out the M&O, because that is exactly how we got ourselves to deferred maintenance, is we've underfunded our maintenance and operations for decades.
Well, that's great, because I think that M&O is enough just to like keep your gears
It's to
turning in the
keep your
building.
in good condition. It doesn't address the $7 billion of deferred maintenance we currently
Right,
have.
and it seems like you would ultimately want to put the money with the district to deploy someone to go fix a thing that's broken. You know, that you don't want like an electrician for every school or like different contracts. So I see that it's nice to have someone who's keeping every day going. Those are your bus drivers, your food servers, like your janitors, etc. Separately, though, I think you could still slice a piece of that off, or just you need to be separately considering, is the district keeping all of the physical plant in mind? How do we not penalize people if they sell off a building? And like, how do we just give them a lot of control in the district over operations and physical plant? That's the only way I personally see anybody wanting to be part of a larger district.
And Justin, sorry, can I ask a clarifying question? Justin, my understanding of how M&O is modeled here, maybe this is a learning opportunity for me, is that is a district level cost, right? It's driven by the number of students, but it's a district, it's up there with like superintendents and business managers. So we would expect them to budget accordingly, I think is.
So Jill, to clarify, you'll see when you look at the school size adjustment that we put M&O at the school size adjustment, because you're going to incur higher costs for maintenance operations in fewer student schools. But it's still, this is a way of getting a level of funding that would go to a district to then make choices. So while we, for a mechanical point of view, put it as part of the school size adjustment, I would expect the district is managing its M&O dollars.
And that actually underscores my point, that you would be concentrating the M&O dollars along with school construction dollars at a higher level. And that, if you combine those dollars, that gets pretty close to the price tag of deferred maintenance and, school construction that is in the report. So to me, when I look at the foundation formula, I still see a desire to lift that out or just leave it in there, but acknowledge that we would have the money in savings to deal with this gorilla in the room. And that's the only reason I could see more people buying into participating in a district.
So, yeah, so I think there's two parts to this conversation. One is in the future state, how do we make sure that schools are resourced to address their maintenance issues so we don't get into a situation where there's extreme deferred maintenance. And then there's a second part of that question, acknowledging that currently we have schools that have significant facility issues. And so I think what I'm hearing from you, and we've heard from other committees, is what are the mechanisms that are available to us to support with those construction needs. You pointed to a couple of multifaceted approach, right? To being able to do that in really creative ways as well, in terms of other opportunities to generate additional funds to reinvest into the district. Also alongside contemplating a school construction aid program. So we've, part of this proposal is recognizing that there is some staging involved in this in terms of understanding how do we define that future state? What does that school portfolio look like before investing dollars in those facility improvements? Recognizing that we want to make sure that those dollars are served in a way to really strengthen the system. But we do understand that as part of this timeline, there's an opportunity for us to get more concrete in this multi-year phase. What does that look like, and what does that happen? And what are the funding mechanisms and resources that may be available to support? So that's a takeaway that we have from other committee questions as well.
Just a quick one. So you quoted a 4% national average O&M facilities.
3%.
3%. Okay. So what's the current across the state?
It's variable.
Every answer is it's variable.
Yeah, so we have some national comparison data, and on average, lots of variability, it's usually under 2%. Because, and you can understand why this happens. You're facing a tough budget decision. Do you cut your M&O budget, or do you cut your beloved, teacher that you've had for 15 years? Districts make the human decision every single time, right? This is not a Vermont problem. We are just per usual, a little bit more acute around this. And we also have the second oldest building portfolio in the nation. So that's not helping us either.
So just thinking about us and time ticking away and maybe not that far away, and have you been actually working on language?
Yes.
And so, by the way, are you looking for time with us this week to roll out the
Governance. Yes, please.
Have we?
Yeah, I think Will is coordinating with our team on this.
Around, which is fine.
Yeah, I think Friday is kind of what's available for us.
Friday, Sunday,
Yes.
okay.
We're looking to release a report by Thursday with more specifics on the governance.
Okay, and then we have to think about how we're gonna do if and how we're gonna do the extra spending portion of this.
That's
What
right.
that's gonna look like and how we
Yes.
Okay.
And there are models in other states of how to establish those equalization mechanisms and caps and things of that nature that would be important to review to ensure that there is equity in the system.
Yeah, the larger the district, the easier it is to do that.
That's right. That's correct.
Um,
So with these
and-
districts, there's more continuity in terms of property wealth across these districts.
So you can do it one of two ways, right? One would be that the state fills in for those districts with less capacity, and that's the reason for limiting, so that it will dollars down. The other way to do it is start with the district with the least ability to raise money and say that district can keep $1 for $1. And then the other districts have to contribute a portion, which actually takes the burden off the state, and then you have less. Anyway, a lot of decisions.
There's a lot of decisions around that component. I think our primary focus has been really developing a base and a weight amount that is generous and we feel can fund a robust education system. Those decisions around the local spend are definitely policy choices, and we have reviewed other states and the mechanisms they put in place for equalization.
Who is our, if I wanted to explore the dollars and understand where they go and explore my theories, who am I talking to in JFO?
I don't know.
Julia and Ezra.
Julia.
Yeah, they have all the numbers.
Okay.
The APA, like all the modeling, so that you can play and model and have fun in the spreadsheets.
Okay.
Okay, well, I think that's it for today. Just philosophically, I think, and I think you're doing this, which I'm really hearing today. I like the idea of devolving authority and, letting teachers be creative in how they teach, and even in some instances developing portions of the curriculum. And I like principals, the idea of principals being able to run their schools and make decisions, make mistakes. But have the ability to be creative and create opportunity. And they all know their communities are also different. And so, and I even in my mind have that, when we talk about the 5 districts, I hope what happens is that we find that one of them excels. And then the question becomes, okay, why is that one excelling and what do we do? So it's not all just a one monolithic. I like the idea of devolution and creativity, creation of opportunity. I know you're trying to do all this, so I'm just really,
And I would say we're doing that too within our current context. So as we're analyzing data, we're identifying, schools that are similar in terms of geography and size. How does their performance compare? And so the agency being able to play a role in facilitating planning among districts so that we can really identify those best practices and how to leverage those across the state is part of what we also see as our role as an agency, because we have that unique statewide view and that ability to look at data across the state to support that type of planning.
Okay, thank you. We'll see you on Friday.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks for your time.